Welcome to the newest episode of the Needless Things podcast. Today's guest is a familiar name if you're a fan of G.I. Joe, Transformers, and a number of the other franchises that we like to talk about here on the show. Please welcome Michael Charles Hill.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, thanks for coming on. It was a pleasure. Well, we've met in person at Joe Fest last year, but prior to that, because Special Mission Brazil is one of my favorite GI Joe things, and I had posted these great display stands.
That was you.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. If you look at Display Joe stands on Facebook, and to be honest, I know he changed the way he was doing things a bit, but I believe he still has a Facebook presence. But I had gotten I've got the whole set of figures, and he had made these great stands, and you saw them on social media and just shot me a message saying, "Hey, those are great. Where can I get those?" And then I ended up finding out, oh my gosh, this is the man who not only because it's funny, I think Cold Slither is probably the credit that folks generally get the most excited for.
Yes, because nobody knew that I created Special Mission Brazil and Captain Claymore because I get no credit on the packaging. And it never occurred to me to take the Claymore character or any of the Special Mission team and include them in an episode. To me, it was just something Hasbro asked me to do, and it was a one and done thing. They never even sent me, which was strange. They never even sent me the package that was an exclusive to Toys R Us.
Right.
Whereas we were receiving, at Sunbow, cases of Transformer toys and G.I. Joe toys. I mean, they even sent us a USS Flag that we put on our coffee table to work as a coffee table.
That's amazing. I wonder if because it was a Toys R Us exclusive, there was a weird different situation with handing out samples or something.
It could be. I think they only made like 15,000 copies.
No idea. All I know is one of the reasons it's my favorite is because it was one of those unexpected things. I got home from school one day and my mom happened to have gone out shopping and found it at Toys R Us, and it wasn't like anything I had seen before because it's these 5 G.I. Joe figures in this box together, and it's so funny because they would never be packaged this way now, because the two in the back, I think it was mainframe and leatherneck in the back, you can hardly even see the figures because of the way they designed the packaging. And there were other cassettes at the time, but those were storybook and cassette was a common thing, but you'd get credits with those because they'd have the accompanying storybook. But in this case, it's just that cassette tape with no information about who produced it, who wrote it, who did anything with it. So
Yeah.
it was odd, everything about it. But I just love Special Mission Brazil. But in that first communication you mentioned, I wrote Cold Slither, and I'm like, whoa, I have a gold mine of G.I. Joe talent that I'm in communication with right now. Unfortunately, since Joe Fest, I've gotten everything back on track and I'm doing interviews again. But before we get to your work with licensed properties, let's talk a little bit about where you came from, how you started writing. What are the origins here?
Oh, wow. Well, I grew up in a small town in Vermont, like Frank Miller, only he grew up in Montpelier, maybe because it's all country roads, maybe a couple hours away from where I grew up, a little town called Manchester. And we had one movie theater, but growing up in the 60s, early 60s, late 60s, we didn't get a lot of first run shows. Okay, we'd get maybe the big road shows that had already played in New York for weeks and weeks and weeks. So most of the movies I watched and I loved would be on Saturdays like westerns and war movies and film noirs with my father, and Sundays would be musicals and comedies with my mother. And I loved movies, but it never occurred to me that there were jobs to be had making those things. I didn't think about directors. I didn't think about writers, although I'm sure, I saw their names in the credits, meant nothing to me. But so when I got out of high school in Vermont, I moved to Southern California. I lived in Orange County and discovered, in addition to being able to see films on the day of their release, I discovered art houses, and I was able to catch up on all the films I didn't get to see when I was in, say, high school, films that I was interested in, especially foreign films. So I got a really quick education because every night would be a different double bill. And at some point, I decided it was a business that I wanted to work in. And I took a filmmaking class at a Santa Ana Community College. And I think the instructor, who was a graduate of USC Film School, basically was asking everybody what it is that they want, why they were taking class, what it is they wanted to do. Yeah. And at the time, like a lot of young, naive people who were interested in breaking into the business, I thought I wanted to be a director. And he said, well, the shortcut to being a director is being a screenwriter. Oh, okay. So, not knowing much, I attempted to write a screenplay. Don't remember what it was about. But within a few years, I had decided that I was going to make the move. I think it was seeing Taxi Driver when it was released in 1976 really pulled the switch for me. And that's when I decided I'm moving to Hollywood. At the same time, I had met I was making contemporary Indian jewelry. This would be about 1975. And there was a guy who claimed to be a producer, film producer, who loved my work and bought every piece I made. And he told me he was going to be producing a film with Walter Matthau at Universal. It's called The Mind with the Dirty Man. It was based on some Broadway play, maybe even an off-Broadway play, and offered me a job as a production assistant. I said, great, break into the business. So I moved to LA, call him up, and he says, oh, we're not going to do the film. Now, again, I'm young, naive, don't understand that the studios put a lot of projects in development and don't make far more films than they do, even back in the 70s. And I was gutted. So, I think Walter Matthau decided he was going to make House Calls with Glenda Jackson. So I just took my flimsy resume from some short films I had worked on and classes I had taken at college, and started hitting the streets. And at the time, there were a lot of production companies in Hollywood that all they did was make commercials. So eventually I got hired on by one of these companies, and then through word of mouth, I ended up working for a lot of different ones. What was great about it was there were a lot of guys who, especially DPs, who were cinematographers for real motion pictures, like Alan Davio, for example, that I would get to work with. And it was a great introduction for anybody interested in film working as a PA, because you get to watch and learn about all the different departments. And if you're on the fence about which way you want to go, or your plan A doesn't work out, there's always a plan B that you can look to for another department that you might want to work in. All right, so then there was what I like to call a fly-by-night film school in Hollywood called Sherwood Oaks Experimental College, run by a guy named Gary Shusett, whose brother Ronald is famous for co-writing the original draft of Alien and the original Total Recall. And Gary used to, I don't know how he did it, but he got great guests, people working in the industry, contemporary and legends, who would come and teach classes or do seminars or do a one night only lecture. So I attended a lot of these things. And during one of those was John Milius.
Oh, wow.
And, what I didn't know until a couple of years later when Flint and I became friends was that Flint was at that same seminar, the screenwriting seminar.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah. I was sitting in the front, so Flint was probably sitting in the back. But then we met, I don't know, like a year or two later.
And for anybody watching or listening that may not know right off the top of their head, Flint is, of course, also a writer.
Yes.
That from G.I. Joe and many other properties as well.
All right. So I was still spending most of my time, taking screenwriting classes, trying to write screenplays. At some point, when Flint and I became friends, we put together the writers group that would meet every Monday night. It was probably about 6 of us, and we'd bring in 10 pages of the script project we were working on and share with everyone else, and then discuss the 10 pages we had brought in the last week. So at one point, I don't know if you know this or not, but Flint's family, now Flint and his sister, own the rights to Buck Rogers.
Whoa, so, no, I didn't know that.
Yeah, his grandfather owned a syndicate of newspapers, and the original Buck Rogers comic strip first appeared in his papers. So by default, he owned the rights to it.
Wow.
So Flint and his agent were shopping the Buck Rogers property around town to animation studios. There had already been a TV series a few years before. Mm-hmm. And nobody was interested, but at one studio, Ruby Spears, they really liked Flint, and they hired him to write for the Mr. T animation show. And I don't know, a week or two later, he calls me up and says, "Hey, how'd you like to get paid for writing?" Now, I'm still working in production. And I went, "Yeah, sure." He says, "Well, I set up a meeting with you and the story editor on a show at Ruby Spears called Dragon's Lair, which I vaguely was aware of because it originally had been an arcade game with animation, first of its kind."
Yeah, that was inescapable at the time. Like that was a pop culture. I think probably Pac-Man and then like Dragon's Lair were two really early. Even if you didn't play video games, you knew about them from like watching Entertainment Tonight or whatever.
Yeah. So had a great meeting with the story editor. I had never written animation before. I never had any interest in writing animation, but I thought, ooh, script fees are good. I don't have to get up at 4 a.m. to be on a soundstage or a location at 6. Yeah, I'll give this a shot. So ABC had ordered 13 episodes for Saturday morning, and I ended up writing 4 of them and decided, I think I'd like to pursue this more. So I went around different studios with my slim resume, and I think the first assignment I got was at Hanna-Barbera for an episode of GoBots, and then at Marvel Productions, because they were still handling all of the creative duties for the Transformers. I as a freelancer, I wrote my first episode of Transformers. And then within 2 months, I get hired by Flint, and I get hired by Sunbow, as they took back control of all the editorial responsibilities for not just Transformers, but G.I. Joe and whatever other shows they were doing. So I know that was long-winded, but
no, that's great. I love hearing that kind of background, and it's very interesting to know that you went into the business and didn't have the intention of being a writer. So were you just comfortable with writing? Like as soon as you got into doing it, it felt like it came naturally to you. It wasn't something where, okay, I can get paid to do this. Let me figure out how it works.
Well, there was a little bit of that, because the difference in writing animation and live action is that everything that you see on the screen, you have to write. So if you have a character entering frame or exiting frame, you have to write that. If you have a character moving towards camera or away from camera, you have to write that. If you want a high angle shot or a low angle shot, you have to write that. You would never, ever do any of that stuff in live action, because you're essentially telling the director how to direct.
Right,
and
right.
They're just not going to have that. But in writing that in animation, and I assume it's still done that way today, but I don't know. It's very helpful to the storyboard artists too, so they don't have to just read kind of a generic scene and then take the time to figure out, all right, well, how am I going to stage this?
So I'm so glad you brought that up, because, well, first of all, you're going to be in Atlanta at Toylanta
Yes.
in March, and I recommend anybody stop by your table and grab a copy of Special Mission Brazil Redux, because this was such a fascinating read for me. So what you've done with this is you took that original story that you wrote for the cassette tape and expanded it into as if it were an episode of Real American Hero.
Yeah, although a short episode, because I suppose I could have added a lot more to it, but I wanted to stay within the frame of the original script that I wrote for the audio tape, which I wrote as a radio drama. So when I originally wrote it, was just dialogue, narration, and sound effects, which I also did not have a copy of. All my original hard copies are in storage in Vermont. So I had to listen to the audio tape, which I had never done before.
That was going to be my next question, was had you listened to it before?
And it was painful, because I had no idea that they didn't use the original actors. They didn't use Wally Burr. And it was excruciating to listen to. It was so bad. But as you now know, I did embellish the overall storyline by adding a lot of new scenes, because I wanted to make it an interesting and fun read as well. And essentially how that came about was, about a year ago, in preparation for Assembly Required 2024, I was asked to write some comic book scripts, G.I. Joe and Transformers, for an exclusive comic book that would be available at the convention. Now, I wasn't involved in the creative process, and had I been, I would have said, well, why are we doing Transformers where this is a G.I. Joe convention? And what they wanted was for G.I. Joe an 8-pager and a 4-pager, and for Transformers the same thing. What I later learned was that they're trying to stay on, it's a fan zine comic book, trying to stay under the radar with Hasbro. And they were trying to position it as a promotional piece for me, because I would have written all the stories. And then even later, I found out they were trying to find a TF Con or TF Nation or some Transformer convention that might be willing to pony up half the cost of getting this thing made and then be available in two separate places. And as it turned out, they couldn't find anybody interested. So then I said, well, let's just make it straight G.I. Joe. We'll do the two stories that I've already written, because I wrote the two G.I. Joe stories first and the 1 8-page Transformer story. And I said, and so the extra pages that you had allotted for the Transformers, I'll just write a script. Then you don't have to worry about, hiring artists and inkers and stuff like that. And so the first thing that came to mind is, well, I'll just convert the old radio drama play into an animation script. And it'll come out to about, I think I had to come up with 12 pages. Then the publisher said, well, adding a couple extra pages doesn't really matter. So I don't know, I think it came up to 15 or 16 pages. So that's how it came about. And I had fun writing it. It was the first animation script I had written, in almost 40 years.
Well, and that's what was so interesting about it, is what you were talking about is how descriptive it is, how specific about the shots of the characters and who's in frame and how they're moving. I don't know that I have read an animation script before, and I had never thought about the fact that it would have to be that descriptive. You would have to lay that down, because it's not a matter of actors memorizing lines and then doing whatever they do on the scenery. It's a whole different thing, and it was a fascinating read. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
And the other point is, the voiceover actors never get to read the scripts. When they show up at the studio, they get what is called sides. So literally on the left-hand column is the character name, and then on the right hand is their dialogue. So, but Wally gets to read the scripts. So the more information Wally has, the better he can explain and suggest to the actor how to play this scene.
And that's because we've done over the years, we've used basically sides, I guess, from animation to do. We did a reading of Charlie Brown Christmas Special, and it read just like a normal, sides, like you're saying. It was just the lines, nothing about, like, there would be cues about what the scene was or whatever, but never anything like this. It was, like I said, it was a very educational read for me. I really enjoyed it. And like I said, any conventions that you're at, I recommend to anyone stop by the table and grab a copy of this, because it's a unique read. So getting involved with Sunbow, you and Flint get hired on, and you're working on, obviously, Transformers and G.I. Joe are kind of the focuses of what we'll talk about today. What was the direction about tone? Because one of the interesting things jumping through, and we'll talk about some of the geek stuff later on, but they're very different tones between different animated shows, as far as how serious they get, how goofy they get, how violent they get. How is that directed?
There was never, I know these days in live action TV, there's a lot of tone meanings. We never really talked about tone. And because the Marvel Productions with the two story editors, Bob Ford, and I forget the other guy's name, they had already done a number of episodes themselves. So my memory is the tone was pretty much established. I don't know if there's a noticeable difference between the episodes once Sunbow started handling all of that compared to when Marvel did.
Sunbow and Marvel flow, like the whole run of the 85 to 87 is pretty, like, there are little ups and downs, but for the most part it feels like the same general thing. But then later on, when the Deke cartoon starts, it's complete, and I have found a lot of enjoyment from the Deke cartoon, but it is a very different, it seems aimed at a younger audience.
Yeah. And I'll get to that in a moment. So Marvel was basically a subcontractor. So they were handling storyboards, they were producing the show on their end. They subcontracted the animators. They even, scheduled the voiceover recording sessions, which I, as a producer of one or both shows, would be in attendance for. So the only thing that Marvel stopped doing once Sunbow West opened was handling the creative part and the story editing part. That was all Sunbow. So it doesn't surprise me that the tone didn't really change that much once Sunbow took over editorial. But yeah, Deke. Oh boy. Yeah, I had written the final episode of season 2 and introduced the idea of the coil.
Yes, and I'm glad you brought that up because that's definitely something I want to talk about. For anybody that doesn't know, or were you about to explain the coil?
Not really. Where I was going to go with it was that Buzz loved the idea. Buzz was planning on leaving Sunbow. He didn't want to be story editor on G.I. Joe anymore. So, but Buzz loved the idea of the coil and had me write up this more detailed pitch of what it was about. And the idea was that season 3 would be predominantly about the coil and Cobra Commander's various attempts at regaining control of Cobra and getting rid of Serpentor. And if I remember correctly, Hasbro loved it too, but they decided they didn't want to fund another season of G.I. Joe. We did 100 or more episodes, and I guess they felt like that was enough. We'll just keep running him in syndication.
I feel like back then that's what happened is what it seems like a lot of these shows, no matter how successful they were, once they got to 100-ish episodes or 100 things that could be cut up into episodes like the miniseries or whatever, they were like, no, we don't care. That's enough for us to continue showing it and making money off of it. We don't need new.
Right. So it was a few years later, I guess, kind of the story that I heard was that Deke approached Hasbro and made a deal with them to produce the shows for probably half as much as what it was costing them with Sunbow and Marvel doing it. And I guess a lot of the production and how they were able to do that, aside from the fact that, in my opinion, Deke, unless it's a show that they bought from somebody else, their animation is just crap. And then they do all their voiceover recording and post-production in Canada, so they were able to save some money there. Because I think they're a American-French-Canadian company. Now, I worked for Deke before. They bought the rights to Sailor Moon.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So it wasn't their animation. It was the original animation.
Right.
But they were recut. And at the time, I had been writing a lot of English dialogue for Japanese animated features.
Oh, that's interesting.
One of them was a thing called Space Adventure Cobra, which
yes.
All right. So it turns out none of the writers in Canada knew how to write English dialogue to fit lip sync, because that was really important to me. So Deke paid me for them an obscene amount of money, because they were also notoriously cheap just for general scripts, to write the pilot episode to teach the Canadian writers how to do it. And but because of their deal with Canadian writers, I wasn't going to get any credit for it, and I was fine. I didn't need a Sailor Moon credit. But anyway, I had worked enough for Deke to know that when they did the G.I. Joe show, and Doug Booth, who worked with us at Sunbow, was hired as a story editor. Doug calls me up and asked me to write a couple of episodes. And I said, sure, fine. I'll take the money. So I wrote them, and to this day, I've never seen them because I don't want my heart broken
Right.
to watch them. And again, way different tone.
Yes.
Definitely for a younger audience. And
what we've noticed, because we've reviewed a number of Deke episodes, and I actually watched it's An Officer and a Viper Man and 3 Shadow of a Doubt,
which I've never seen.
And I'll tell you what we've noticed in reviewing Deke episodes is the scripts could have been Sunbow. It's the animation, the voice acting, and like some of the sound effects and things. It's like the stories are still solid stories. It's just that they don't receive what Sunbow gave them.
Yeah, and that's probably due in part to Doug Booth's participation and Doug calling a lot of us who worked on G.I. Joe to come write for him. The other thing, too, is, and Steve Gerver, I think, is responsible. When we wrote for G.I. Joe and it kind of bled into Transformers, we were writing 55 to 60 page scripts and with a lot of detail. So not all of that would make it into the script, but it would all be animated. And then whoever the director at Marvel Productions assigned to the project would then have to either trim scenes or cut scenes out altogether to fit 22 minutes. Because generally speaking, in live action, 1 page equals 1 minute. But in animation, 2 pages equals 1 minute. And we were doing 22-minute episodes. Now, Deke, they didn't want 55, 60 page scripts. They wanted like 35, definitely no more than 40. Because they didn't want to animate.
Right.
You know, there are a lot of scenes in their shows where it'll be an over-the-shoulder shot, and you're seeing the back of the head of one character, and that's the character talking. And the
Right,
other,
yeah.
and the other character he's talking to is just static.
Yeah.
They didn't want to. It was very, very limited animation.
Well, it's funny you know, I look back at watching that stuff and not the GI Joe Deke, because I honestly hadn't even seen that until probably 15 or so years ago. But looking back when I was a kid, like I was aware of the differences between like Sunbow, Hanna-Barbera, Filmation. Like they all had different processes for their animation, but it didn't matter. What mattered to me was the stories and the characters. Like the animation, yeah, it was important and there were things that I liked more than others, but if something was going to get me, it was really more about the writing than it was about the look.
And yeah, when it comes to the writing, I've had a lot of this conversation many times. Is you have to remember this was pre-internet, social media. Yeah. We didn't know there were fans of the show.
Right.
We certainly weren't getting fan letters. We knew how we were doing in the Nielsen ratings, and you know, the Sunbow shows were killing it. I think we were always in the top 5. So there was no kind of, you know, instant feedback to anything that we were doing, and so mostly the stories that we told, we were trying to entertain ourselves and entertain, especially at the Sunbow office, entertain the other guys in the office. You know, like Flint's office was on the other side of my wall, Buzz was across the hall, Doug was down the hall around the corner. And so we were just trying to entertain each other.
I think there's probably a lot of value in the process being more pure in that way, and in not being aware of the audience feedback.
Yeah. Plus, we also thought these shows the last couple of years,
Yeah.
they'll get canceled. You know,
And nobody will ever talk about them again.
yeah, some new bright shining object would come along, and they'd
Right.
make a toy show out of that. And 20 years from now, nobody would. Transformers. What the hell was that?
Yeah.
So,
So one thing I did want to ask you about though, and this is a great segue, or you created a great segue. So you were writer on Return of Optimus Prime for Transformers. Was there a level of awareness of what the death of Optimus Prime, like, were those episodes a response to what happened in the movie, or was that just a thing that was like, well, we should bring this money-making character back?
oh yeah, it was definitely a response. I
Okay.
think towards the end of the third season, I think Flint was no longer story editor. Either he was burnt out on Transformers, or he was too busy working on Visionaries and Inhumanoids. So Marv Wolfman, who'd been writing as a freelancer some episodes, took over. And so it definitely was a response to, again, we didn't hear anything directly. We heard through, the executives at Sunbow East were relaying information from Hasbro. And that was, I mean, there are probably a lot of stories, but the sort of classic one was that they got a phone call from some very distressed mother who son had locked himself in the bathroom, crying hysterically, and wouldn't come out until Optimus Prime was no longer dead. And Hasbro, you got to do something about it. And then, of course, Hasbro then turns to us and says, "You guys got to do something." So that's how that came about. And so Marv and his writing partner on that story, Cherry Wilkerson, I think they designed it as a 2-part episode. So Marv had done an outline and a script for part 1, and did a very loose, maybe 5 pages outline for part 2. And I end up writing that, but I only take teleplay credit because I wanted to make sure that Marv and Sherry got credit because it was their original idea, not mine. But how I came to write it is that in addition to my contract with Sunbow as an in-house producer, I had a separate contract to write a minimum number of scripts per year. And every year, as we get close to the end of the year, I might be short a few scripts. And I'm thinking, ooh, I got a pay or play deal. They'll have to pay me not to write scripts. But, they weren't going to have that. So I remember Carol Weitzman, who was a VP in the New York office, and she used to come out about once a month, came into my office one day and told me that I was going to write Return of Optimus Prime Part 2. And I was fine with that because it was Transformers. It was the final story of the season, and I was going to write the final episode, and I was going to bring Optimus Prime back to life. I thought, great, I'm happy.
And did that have a significance to you at the time? Like, did you have an awareness of, oh, this is actually kind of a big deal?
Oh yeah, we knew that the death of Optimus Prime was a big deal, and Hasbro was scrambling to get us to fix it. So so I was conscious of what I was doing when I was doing it. Now, in that same conversation, I also was told I had to write an episode of Gem, which I did not want to do at all. I kept telling Carol, but I'm the boys' toys guy, not the girls' toys. And so I pitched a story idea that I was convinced Hasbro would hate. Because one of the few mandates that we had in any of the shows is that nobody could die. You couldn't have a gun battle and have a character die.
Right.
If you shot, a Cobra plane out of the sky, you had to make sure you saw them being parachuting to safety. Yeah. And in fact, we couldn't even have bullets. That's why everybody in both G.I. and Transformers is lasers. So I wrote this. I did a story that was basically one of the characters in the show finds their father's diary in the attic, and as they're reading the diary, everything is a flashback to different times in their life earlier. And the big part, or a part of the Gem mythology, is that her mother was like a 60s folk singer. So, stealing a page out of The Death of Carol Lombard, I wrote this very graphic scene of her mother on tour and her plane smashing into the side of a mountain, blowing up, and she's dead, and everybody's crying. And I thought, oh, they'll hate it because I'm showing killing off a character, right. And they loved it. And unbeknownst to me, it became every Gem fan's favorite episode because it makes every Gem fan cry.
And it's this fine line, and particularly with animation in the 80s, of, like you said, not showing any permanent harm or anything like that. But that episode is so impactful because it defines the character's life. Too? Oh, I've seen it. We've talked about all the Sunbow stuff in one form or another, but also just that episode. And I'm certainly not as big a fan of Jim as I am of Transformers or G.I. Joe, but that episode has impact. It's huge because we didn't see things like that a lot back then. So it does have impact, and it does come across as more important than other ones. And that stuff resonates and it sticks with kids. And I think it's important. That's why I always appreciate Larry Hama talking about wanting to show death and loss and things in the G.I. Joe comic book, because I think it's important for kids to see that stuff.
Yeah. Well, you bring up an interesting point, because one of the things that we were all very conscious of, unlike this, the previous Saturday morning cartoons we used to write for, we were determined not to write down to kids. And I mean, it was definitely important to us, and it turns out it ultimately, whether they knew it or not, became important to the kids who grew up on that stuff. Then the other thing too, and Flint and I used to talk about this a lot, when we kind of sit around the room and look at all of us who were brought into Sunbow, we each came from different backgrounds with a strong suit. So for me, it was writing live action scripts. So I never thought, even though I had to write all that detail for storyboard artists, I never felt like I was writing a cartoon. I was thinking of it as, these are real people. Now, having said that, I've written some really goofy stuff that might raise your eyebrow and say, really? You're thinking live action? But in general, that's the way I was approaching it. Flint's background, even though he also was a screenwriter, was he brought games. The idea, because he was big into games. At its time, it was predominantly board games. Steve Gerber, his comics background. Yeah. So we all kind of brought those backgrounds into the mix, which I think helped to make the stories better, or at least make the ideas of the stories better, than the narrow constraints you have in Saturday morning cartoons, which were aired by the networks, which, you had to deal with standards and practices and all that stuff that we didn't really have in the syndicated shows.
Yeah. So do you have any, sticking with G.I. Joe for a bit here, do you have any specific memories of Ninja Holiday? which is the episode where Sergeant Slaughter replaces another Joe to go to a fighting tournament. And it's to me, it's almost the perfect mini 80s action movie, because you have this, all those movies like Bloodsport and like with the Kumite and the fighting tournament and whatever else, like it it feels like this perfect little encapsulation of all of the action stuff of the 80s.
The only memory I have was coming up with the title. I really liked it. Um, and I think I was had Enter the Dragon was some inspiration for me. But here's my big memory. Part of my job as producer of the G.I. Joe series, in addition to writing the PSAs and my scripts and doing the voiceover recording sessions and the sound mix sessions, was to make sure that every Friday afternoon I had a brand new script to be sent over to Marvel Productions so they could assign it to a storyboard artist, and sometimes 3, breaking it up into acts for them to get started over the weekend. So on Wednesdays, I would start calling the writers and say, "Hey, how's it going? Do I have your script yet? Are you gonna, you have it in on tomorrow or Friday morning?" And there was one writer in particular, and I won't mention his name, but his response was always, "Well, do you want it good or do you want it on time?" And my response would always be, "Well, I want both." So he was a great writer. He went on to do a lot of work in live action TV. So Thursday night, I don't have the script. So I just stay in the office all night and I pound out a script, and I'm making it up as I go along, because all I'm concerned about is I have a script tomorrow morning that I can send out to Marvel, and that was Ninja Holiday.
Ah, that's great. I love that. Because I think it's interesting when you have a schedule, and there are times when whatever the work is, whether it's writing or accounting or whatever it may be, there are times when you have plenty of time, and you're able to really focus and take whatever amount of time it is and put out the product you're supposed to put out. But then there are other times where there's a crunch and you produce something, and when you're done, you wonder how did I manage to get something that maybe isn't quite as up to snuff as when I had the longer amount of time, but it's still good stuff. It still meets the standard. It's still quality. It's a very interesting process of how we can function under pressure in that way.
Yeah, and the system we had at Sunbow was, I don't think any of us rolled into the office before 10 o'clock in the morning. Sometimes we take long lunches. But what we were very conscientious of is making our deadlines. So if that means we had to work late on any given day or a couple of days in a row, or in my case, spend the night there working on a script to make a deadline, we did it. Now, Steve Gerber was famous for he would never roll in before 2 o'clock in the afternoon. In fact, we had a pool that we'd all put a dollar in, and this is every day of what time Steve was going to come in, and what would be his excuse for being late. And I didn't always get the what time right, but I always got the excuse right, because Steve Gerber was famous for saying, in response to, what happened, was, "You don't want to know." But Steve also liked to work late at night. So sometimes he would come in, when we were all going home, and then he would leave in the morning when we were all coming in.
So schedule wise, what was the general turnaround from having presenting the script to seeing the episode air, or when it aired? Obviously, you're not sitting there watching all of them, but
Yeah. Well, typically, I'll start with the writing process first. So you get a premise approved. Then I think had a week to come up with the outline. So your premise could be a page, page and a half long. Your outline is probably 12 to 15 pages. So once that's approved, then you have 2 weeks to come up with your first draft, which, as I said earlier, was 55, 60 pages long. And then the story editor would make some notes of changes and maybe give it back to you to rewrite. And then you'd have an extra week for that. So, say about a month from the time you get the assignment to turning in the script, and then it would go off to Marvel. Now, I don't remember the turnaround time between when I would get the storyboards back, because then I'd have to review the storyboards and compare them to the script to make sure they followed it correctly. And I don't remember how much time went by before I'd get the rough cut of the animation that I have to view and then make notes about all the animation errors that need to be fixed. But I would say from the time you started the writing process to the time the show would air, I'm going to guess about 6 months.
that makes sense. And before we wrap things up here, are there any PSAs that stand out in your mind, or favorites to you, or any? Because I would imagine coming up with that many, because every episode had a PSA. That's a lot of morals to throw out there. Like,
I know. I was
did it
just
get
churning
tough?
them out. And I, I don't remember writing them individually per episode. I think I just maybe spent a week, although not full time because I had other things to do, just writing dozens of these things. And then I don't know who made the decision to which ones would be attached to which shows. I don't even remember doing the recordings of them because it would have made sense to do them at the tail end of doing an episode as opposed to a special session. But maybe it was. I have no memory of sitting in on those. But yeah, I mean, I tried to, I had what, 30 seconds?
Yeah, very brief. I can
Yeah.
almost imagine you getting into a mindset of like, all right, it's teaching time, and you know what I mean? Like in a different frame of mind from writing a full animated story, of being like, all right, it's time to convey some lessons, and being able to sit down and write a chunk of them.
Yeah, and most of them I pulled from my own childhood of things my parents told me about or warned me about, or rules about oh, you can't go swimming until an hour after you've eaten your lunch. But primarily, what they were designed for was Hasbro's way of countering Peggy Sharon's Action for Children's television group by saying, see, yeah, we are an educational show. So that's really what they were designed for. But yeah, I didn't put a lot of thought into them. I just kind of knocked them out. I wasn't getting paid for them. It was part of my job as a producer. Right. Just like I didn't get paid for Special Mission Brazil and Captain Claymore. It was part of my job. But it wasn't until probably 2004, 2005 that a friend of mine's teenage son told me about these YouTube videos.
Oh, the Fensler films.
And I thought they were hilarious. I've had a few people ask me if I'm offended by them, and I say no. I think they're great.
They are absolutely. Well, this has been a fantastic conversation. Before we go, is there anything else you want to chat about before we wrap it up? And where can we find you and what are you up to?
Oh, yeah, there's still probably a lot to talk about, but maybe we can do another one someday.
Oh, I would absolutely love to.
If you talk about the coil or any specific other episodes that I've done, and yeah, I'd be happy to do another one. What am I up to these days? Well, I have a few conventions lined up this year. We already talked about Tourlanta, and I will be bringing the few Joe scripts I have. I'm working actually on a new one. I wrote a brand new script for a live script reading for Assembly Required. That was, and that's called King for a Day Redux, because it was based on the 8-page comic book script I wrote. And so I was asked to do another one for the DFW Joe show, which looks like it might not happen because it might not be enough of the guests available to do a voiceover reading with their characters. But I think I might go ahead and write it anyway because it's about the coil. And I feel like there have been a lot of other people taking the idea of the coil and doing their own thing. And I feel like, well, maybe I should, based on what little I remember of what I wanted to do, kind of put my own official stamp on it. So I'm working on that. I'm doing a Transformer convention. What's it called? Now I can't remember. In Fort Wayne, Indiana, in June as well. And I got something else lined up this year. Now I can't remember what it is. But I'll post all that stuff on my Facebook page.
Yeah, and we'll have in the notes for this, people will be able to click on links and figure out where you're going to be. This was awesome. Absolutely. I would love to have you back on in the future, and we'll get a little more in depth with some of the things. I think we laid a good foundation here today. But yeah, absolutely. We will talk again soon. But for now, Michael, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, thank you. And will I see you in Atlanta?
Yes, you will. I will be there.
Great. Cool.
All right. Thanks a lot, man.
Smash that like button if you like Needless Things.